Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I'm your host, as always, Patrick McFarlane. This one is episode number 203, and the show notes may be found at libertyweekly.net/203. And I am joined by my colleague and longtime friend at the Libertarian Institute, Mr. Keith Knight. How's it going, man?
Going very well, brother. Very glad we are getting into Dr. Malone's work today. I have liked this guy since I saw him. Gosh, it had to have been on Brett Weinstein's show on Odyssey.com because YouTube took it down. So I'm doing very well. Glad that we're getting into a different line of inquiry here.
Yeah, I haven't discussed him very much on my show at all, but just wanted to remind everyone before we get into it that you can find our work as well as the work of our friends and colleagues at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org. And you can also find the podcasts of Tommy Salmons there and the great Kyle Anzalone, as well as Scott Horton, who's our director over at the Libertarian Institute. And yeah, man, there's so much stuff going on right now. It feels like I just have whiplash looking back and forth. And in the news just recently, we won't touch on it in this podcast, but the Ukraine, the U.S.-Ukraine standoff, or crisis, I guess it's being called, has really kind of reached a fever pitch with the United States saying that Russia's going to invade on Tuesday, that they're going to invade Ukraine, which is just insanity. So hopefully by the time you hear this, the world hasn't ended, although, you know, we've covered in the prospects of a real Russian invasion of Ukraine just don't really seem to be in the cards. But also going on is the Canadian trucker protest, and I haven't covered that at all, but that is what this letter here relates to. So we have an article here by Robert Malone that was rerun on thegreatlootrockwell.com, and this is an open letter to the Canadian truckers. Keith.
So I am going to read a portion of the letter. Pat, I'd like for you and I to comment sort of as we go, because as great as Malone is in his section of things, he might not have the political science, rather. Of course, he has the medical scientific aspect to it that we have, either with regard to philosophy, history, or economics. So I just wanted to go through this because I think he made so many valuable contributions. I saw an image of his, a quote from his Joe Rogan appearance where he says, "This is the first time that I studied in the scientific literature where the lack of effectiveness of a certain medicine, the vaccines, is being blamed on people who haven't taken the medicine." So it's not like the left, who's so for the workers and the proletariat, they didn't blame the bourgeoisie big pharma. No, they blamed their neighbors. They blamed the working class. They blamed what you could call disproportionately black population, because it's something like only 30% or 40% of blacks have gotten the vaccine. So this really is something shocking if you're looking at things from a very favorable perspective. So here is Robert Malone, February 12th, 2022. This is from his Substack. "My name is Robert Malone. I am a United States-based physician and scientist. We all stand on the shoulders of giants. The simple truths are what matter most. Honest words spoken from the heart can change the world. We should not have politicized the public health response to SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 so quickly." Obviously, he appreciates we should not have politicized this thing, because anytime politics is entered into something, you more or less poison the well by getting people who have no incentive to get informed and every incentive to make something overly emotional. You bring them into the discussion, which makes things much more worse than they otherwise would be. Imagine if we had to vote on which microphone or computer or type of house that people should live in, or which religion. Shouldn't we vote on a religion so we make sure people aren't going to hell or wasting their life erroneously believing that they might go to hell? So certainly religion should be voted on. But no, when you politicize anything, you make things worse. Pat, what is your take on whether or not things should be politicized? Because the left, it's good to make things political. You bring them into the public realm where people have the incentive to get informed, and the citizens are involved instead of just greedy private profiteers.
Well, when you politicize something, it has this implication of that someone is going to be making a decision that other people have to live by. And that's where the conflict, in a lot of conflict, comes from in the world. And we know as advocates of the free market that the market brings down those conflicts because it has a way of solving these things. And I don't mean to plagiarize Dave Smith, but he always has a great point where, you see all these things happening on the internet and you feel like the world is ending and everyone hates everyone. But then you go to the grocery store, and at least before, when people weren't wearing masks all the time and there were fights over masks, but you would just go to the grocery store and you'd see everyone just going about their business. Or you would go and hail a taxi in New York City, and him being a Jew, he would hail down a Muslim cab driver, and they would exchange pleasantries, and the cab driver would take him where he needed to go. And then there would be money exchanged and thank you, have a good day, whatever. So not to say it's all hunky-dory all the time, but that's generally the way that the market works. And I'm trying to think of how I thought at the beginning of COVID-19, and I'm not surprised that things got political because, of course, that's just the way everything works. That's how the people that stand to gain from exploiting a crisis, that's how they gain things, is pitting the two sides against each other and really having that conflict and chaos go. Order out of chaos. So that's kind of the way that things are going. And as far as your comment, Keith, on liberals, it's so strange because it would seemingly all of this goes against their core tenets of fairness and being against big pharma and big corporations. But also, I think the left also has this streak of making other people fairness under authority. Is that if I'm being forced to do something, well, then everyone else has to be forced to do it too. Or that you just need to conform kind of thing.
Sure, something that I've always seen. It's sad. The only type of diversity they believe in is when it comes to race and sex. No intellectual diversity. Well, if we come across that, well, that's Joe Rogan. That needs to be canceled. That's a threat to all civilization. So Malone goes on to say, and Justin Trudeau should have focused on managing the actual ground truth of COVID-19 instead of following the script provided to him by the leadership of the World Economic Forum. I am a physician and a scientist now, and I'm highly trained and experienced in developing vaccines and other medicines. But I've also been a carpenter and a farmhand, and I still work my farm. I drive a MC dually diesel flatbed, a Kubota farm tractor, and can run a skid loader or drive a team of Percheron horses. I feel like I mispronounced like half of those words. I have shown my Percheron foals at the Royal Winter Fair. By the original meaning, I am a teamster. I come to you with an open heart, committed to healing, bringing 3 simple words: integrity, dignity, community. Please correct me on anything that I mispronounced there.
Well, you pronounce it with such confidence. I think it's Percheron. I don't know.
I just said it fast. The point is that we tend to distinguish people into the scientist class who knows what they're talking about, and then the everyday man. Whereas Malone is not necessarily in one of these other groups. The Joe Rogan fans of the world, like me, say that he's a scientist who has dedicated his life to research with regard to mRNA technology and therefore is more qualified than many more citizens that we have come across. Whereas those people say, well, he's been on Joe Rogan and he's been on Brett Weinstein and he's been on Steve Bandit's show. He's not legitimate, obviously. So, I mean, unless you're part of the state or one of their collaborators, they have no skepticism until you no longer belong to one of their in-groups. He goes on to discuss some shocking contributions from someone who is not necessarily in our field. Pat, would you mind reading from the word? These are three down to the plain for all to see portion.
So these are three simple words that ring like bells in the heart of honest people. Benito Mussolini once said that going up, he's referring to dignity, integrity when he's talking about those three words. But then he quotes Benito Mussolini in opposition to those three words. Benito Mussolini once said, quote, fascism should be more properly called corporatism, since it is the merger of the state and corporate power. And in the actions of the governments of Ottawa and Canada, we are now able to clearly see the previously hidden face of global fascist totalitarianism, by which I mean the fusion of the power of large corporations with the power of the state, as fascism has been defined by Mussolini. We are now seeing shocking signals of desperation from our globalist, corporatist opponents. The incompetence of the party of Davos is becoming plain for all to see. Now, just as initial thought off those words, I really want those words to be true, what he's saying. I don't think I can agree that we're seeing desperation from the power elites. Maybe that's just a difference of opinion. Maybe I'm just cynical. What do you think, Keith?
I think we are seeing desperation in the sense that the head of the CDC has come out and, oh gosh, what did she say the other day? Well, let's take the top CNN doctor, the Asian woman who's constantly on there. She said masks are little more than facial decorations. We have the CEO of Pfizer saying 1 to 2 shots does more or less nothing at COVID-19 in the face of Omicron. Well, could you imagine if he had said that when they were first ushering in these vaccines? The first 2 will do nothing, says the CEO. We have Fauci, of course, in March of 2020. That's still valid. The fact that they didn't fire him, either he gave misinformation and was accidentally wrong, either way he needs to be fired, or he's evil and he needs to be fired. There's no innocent explanation for why they kept Fauci on. Besides, he's willing to lie for the regime. When it comes to the lockdowns, which of the doctors were saying lockdowns aren't going to work? We're going to see no difference between places that lock down and places that don't lock down. That's the sort of credibility that I am looking for. So because I don't see any of that, I don't see any active in your face, I'm really trying to convince you. I have a lot of data. I have a lot of arguments. That's why I agree that they are in a mode of desperation. Criticism of Fauci, he responds to as anyone who criticizes me is really criticizing science. Really, motherfucker. Anyone who criticizes me is really criticizing philosophy. That is just so arrogant that I have to put it in the desperation category. Joe Biden coming out and saying there is no federal solution to COVID. A lot of mask mandates dropping. I think it is desperation, but I could be wrong. People like you and Mark Claire disagree and say that the narrative is just as strong as ever. So maybe I am just seeing things through a lens that is unjustified, but I do feel it's desperate. You don't?
I don't mean to we're trying to get through this letter, and I guess I don't mean to roadblock it or anything, but it's just despite all those things, it feels like all the backpedaling, it just feels like the whole agenda is still going forward anyways. They're there's still like parents vaccinating their children and parents fighting over it in family court. I have a case right now. And I don't know. It's just like it's hard. I'm sure the audience will relate to this, but it's just hard to see this changing. I don't know. But so what's the next point here?
Let me go on. He makes 4 points with regard to his addressing the trucker incident. Point number 1. For the first time, we can clearly see that they are willing and able to collude with Silicon Valley to weaponize the banking system against us. Taking $10 million from a political fundraising campaign is something that most of us could not have imagined 2 years ago. Clearly, this has backfired because it's exposed to everyone that there was an unnatural coordination between government, the information technology sector, and the banks. And now we have direct video evidence of this collusion from the infamous Zoom call recording documenting the involvement of the government and the mayor of Ottawa. So for those of you who haven't seen it, it was literally the government of Canada who told it was suspected that they told GoFundMe to stop the campaign contributions from people to GoFundMe to the truckers protesting the mandates, but it was more or less confirmed in a discussion about God Save Us. What is the name of, but whatever the company that that took over for GoFundMe. So GoFundMe said, we're not giving this money to the truckers. Everyone will have a refund by February 19th, the latest. So they used an alternative and raised the same amount of money, and the state stole that money. And then they bought up all of the hotels in that area so people couldn't come, stay, and support the truckers. So they would have a much smaller audience than they otherwise would. So obviously, the optics are everything. They know this. This is why they plan the seating arrangements in all political speeches and all of these campaign rallies, because if it looks like a lot of people are there, you have what's called a social proof. So people say, well, a lot of people support this guy, Joe Biden. 80 million people voted for him? Well, certainly I should get on his team. A lot of people like Pete Buttigieg. A lot of people liked Donald Trump or Barack Obama or George Bush. Well, simply by assuming fewer people like something, you're less likely to be attracted to it. And the more people that like something, the more likely you are to be attracted to it. So it's not just the money. It's the social proof that's involved with this. Sorry that went on long, but a guy named Robert Cialdini wrote a book called Influence, and he said that social proof and seeing other people doing a thing is so powerful when it comes to whether or not people see something as legitimate and worthy of their time or illegitimate and unworthy of their time. I think it's just worth it. Are you familiar with any of this?
No, I mean, I just from my undergrad degree, I'm familiar with some of those aspects of the psychology experiments, like the Milgram experiment and things like that, the bystander effect. But I think the bystander effect plays into that because I think it goes both ways. So there's the famous case of the woman who's being assaulted in New York City in an alleyway, and there's literally hundreds of people walking by, and the larger number of people there are, the responsibility diffuses. Like the responsibility to intervene diffuses amongst them. So the more people who witness something horrible happening, the less likely it is that one individual will like intervene. But on the flip side, if you're in a crowd and one person starts dancing, maybe some people will start to laugh at that person or just whatever. But then all of a sudden there's another person that starts dancing when they see it. And then all of a sudden, there's 30 people dancing and people look and see and they're like, oh, that looks kind of fun. I want to be a part of that. So I think those are observable parts of that psychology.
Patrick, read number 2 for me, please.
So the censorship is ramping up, and our opponents are no longer really trying to justify it. The attacks on Joe Rogan are truly a desperate act. To attack the most beloved media icon in North America has so much downside, and again shows that they are coordinating. Did you know that Spotify and Moderna share the same #1 investor? Bailey Gifford Asset Management owns 11.5% of both companies. And now we know that Neil Young has a financial conflict of interest because of the large investment bank that owns about half of the financial rights for his song catalog. This strategy is backfiring. Joe Rogan is still strong, and the central pharmaceutical and banking system hated more than ever. It will take more than Neil Young to shut down Joe Rogan.
I love this line. The central implying large scale, very few people affecting a large amount of people. Word central. Pharmaceutical and banking system. So it's not individuals making, coming up with scientific theories, writing their own papers, doing their own experiments. There's systems where individuals are very heavily constrained by other individuals who have less of an incentive to provide a good product or service. Hated more than ever. I would say the word hated is pretty accurate when it comes to Brian Stelter or Bill Gates or anyone else. Malice famously said that there's more of a gap between the cathedral and the average person today than there ever has been in his lifetime. And I think that's correct, and I think it's a good thing. So people are much more willing to either question it or just not recognize it as legitimate. So it'll take more than Neil Young. Yeah, I would say it certainly is going to take more than Neil Young. Any final comments on this before we get to points 3 and 4?
Nope, I don't think so. Hey everyone, and welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. Your one-stop shop is libertyweekly.net/support. And once you're there, you can see all the different ways to support my content. There is a Amazon wishlist there you can check out. There's also a PayPal button, paypal.me/libertyweekly for one-time donations. There's also a Patreon button and a Subscribe Star button where you can donate on a monthly basis in exchange for the bonus content that I do offer. So go check those out. There's an archive there with actually hundreds of posts going back years, and you get all access to all those things with your donation. There's also cryptocurrency addresses there with all the addresses for the cryptocurrencies that I accept. If you don't see one there you'd like to donate, just get in touch with me. And if you want access to bonus content but you don't want to pay a monthly fee, you can go over to Odyssey, libertyweekly.net/Odyssey, ODYSEE, and you can purchase my bonus content there a la carte, and you can purchase it for LBC, which is the cryptocurrency that the website runs on. The best deal for subscribing and getting my premium content, though, is to go to Rokfin.com, Rokfin. You can, for $10 a month, get access to tons of your favorite creators. And you also get access to my premium content there as well. And there's a lot of great creators there that you can check out on the screen here. But for you listening in the audio version, Last American Vagabond, Monica Perez and Brad Binkley from the Propaganda Report, Joanne Leone from Around the Empire, Kyle Anzalone as well from the Libertarian Institute. Just a whole bunch of people. Whitney Webb from Unlimited Hangout. So go check that out. One monthly subscription gets you access to all of that. And if you like my writing, I do sometimes release blog posts that don't end up on the Libertarian Institute on my Substack /Substack. So you can go check that out as well and see some of my writings for my email list. And of course, the Liberty Weekly podcast appears on the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org, alongside other fine podcasts, Scott Horton, Pete Quinones, Free Man Beyond the Wall, Conflicts of Interest with Kyle Anzalone, Don't Tread on Anyone with Keith Knight, my show, and also Year Zero with Tommy Salmons. So go check out those other fine podcasts and help support the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org. Thanks, everybody, and back to the show.
Here are points 3 and 4. So point 3 is, so desperate are these conspirators, they've now literally asked the U.S. Department of Defense to commit a felony, changing data in the Defense Medical Epidemiological Database. Stupidly, it has already been released and is now being studied by the medical community. They were caught with their pants down, changing data after the fact. My guess is that this deserves criminal investigation. This will also backfire because now people are personally exposed, and my guess will run for the hills or become whistleblowers. I hear that lawyer Thomas Renz is being inundated with new whistleblower actions and information releases. Mr. Attorney Patrick McFarland, what can you tell us about point number 3?
So I'm just so cynical. Right? I don't know if I'm just feeling cynical tonight or what it is, but man, like the bar is so filled with people who do not want to touch COVID, especially like with larger lawsuits. But it seems like the attorneys that, I don't know if they're afraid of their reputation or if they just buy into everything. I mean, the institution of the state bar associations, like if you go to the Wisconsin State Bar website, they have like a mat. There's like a cow at the top right-hand corner. Sounds weird, but this is Wisconsin. There's a cow in their logo. And once the pandemic started, the cow had a mask on it. And then there's like bars advertising for like social justice and stuff across the webpage. And it really just seems like people are just going along with it. But what you do have, and I guess not to like pat myself on the back or toot my horn, but attorneys are so essential in the resistance to this. And not that I have an incredible amount of faith in the rule of law, because we've already talked about how that's myth on this show. But you're playing essentially in the realm of what the state itself is. The state, like when you get to the essence of what its monopoly is, it's the legal system. And so you're playing in their ball field, you're playing in their monopoly system, but you have to do it. You have to have a prong that does that. And there's just so few lawyers that are willing to take up that mantle right now.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's got to be discouraging. I spoke with Mark Victor about representing one of the gentlemen who was convicted of conspiracy against the government and treason on January 6th. This was actually something he said in front of everyone. And the way they're treating this guy is exactly the same way they were treating, Muslims or anyone who was 6 degrees from Osama bin Laden on anytime after September of 2001. So it's terrible that all the power we give the state is eventually used against us. Finally, point number 4 that Malone gives us. It's time to end the fake emergency powers, which have been used to suspend your constitutional and natural rights. The reason I am still such a sucker for natural rights is because of people's ability to invoke them when it comes to historical narratives. So historical narratives being any prevailing interpretation of past events that people simply recognize as legitimate, which inform their current decision-making process. So, for example, if you say Glass-Steagall was deregulation, deregulation caused the financial crisis, therefore we need a large state, you recognize the state as one being legitimate and to a large state being legitimate because of a historical narrative. But what Malone does here is he invokes natural rights, which people seldom do in the COVID discussion. So it's never like, you come across people saying, well, it's important that we do studies about how blacks have been since the end of Jim Crow and see if ending Jim Crow worked or not. And we should deprive women of rights because we have to see if it works or not. Because works is like the dumbest, most vague, ridiculous thing you could ever say. That anytime you're depriving human beings of their natural right to life, liberty, property, or the pursuit of happiness, what you're essentially doing is stripping them of their humanity, something so unjust that you would need a vast amount of empirical research or justification to do so. So unless I see you're about to walk in front of the train going 100 miles an hour, I don't have the right to grab you and move you to a different location. But Malone does this. The reason this is so important is because people were literally willing to just sit at home and wait for their governors to tell them whether or not they can put something on their face to restrict their breathing, or whether or not they can open their business, or whether or not they can go to work, or whether or not their kids can see other kids and experience human interaction. So because people have sort of disregarded their natural right to do things, even though they invoke them in every other historical context. They don't say slavery was bad because it hurt GDP. They say slavery is inherently immoral. Women were inherently mistreated. Of course, they never mention the male-only draft. But again, natural rights, Malone is definitely an ally. Sorry I went on this. Finally, he finishes point number 4. There is no emergency. Treatment strategies for curing COVID-19 using repurposed drugs were discovered by March of 2020. Omicron is not a killer. The censorship must stop. Patrick, final comments on point number 4 by Dr. Robert Malone.
Okay, so let me tell you something else. I've gotten involved in a few COVID litigation issues, and I'll just say through that work, I've learned something, is that the FDA has approved certain drugs like ivermectin as being safe. Now, healthcare practitioners, family physicians, they prescribe drugs all the time. Maybe 40% of all the drugs that they prescribe are off-label uses. So they would prescribe Tylenol, I don't know, extra strength or what have you, prescription strength, whatevers. They prescribe it for something that the FDA has not authorized that drug to treat. That happens for like 30 or 40% of all prescriptions that are prescribed. So it is common practice for doctors to prescribe medication for off-label uses. And there's something like, so 5 years ago, they were prescribing things off-label, and they would just have to give a disclaimer saying, okay, well, you understand I'm prescribing this medication, but it's not for traditionally approved for what you have and for what I'm prescribing it for, just so you know. And pharmacists would confirm that. So this witch hunt for ivermectin being prescribed for an off-label use is complete garbage, because it's been going on. It's common practice in the medical field for decades. Just a little aside, speaking from experience that I've had. But yeah, I'm really glad that Malone is framing it in natural rights theory. I mean, I don't know if we could ask for anything better than that.
Certainly.
Aside from reading Hans Hoppe or something.
I know a nice quote from Theory of Socialism and Capitalism, that would just be spoiling us rotten. But we got to have something to work towards. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you about the last 4 episodes you have contributed to the Libertarian Institute. Give me a brief thesis and or summary of what these episodes are about so people can check them out on their own. Episode 202, How Judicial Supremacy Dooms COVID Challenges.
I don't know if I can do this, man. You're asking me to be brief.
Do it briefly. That's the constraint.
So my last episode, I talked about a specific challenge to mask orders in schools that went through a federal district court in New York. And the challenge to the mask order was shot down. And I used it to talk about judicial supremacy, which is something I've covered in my podcast, saying that judges shouldn't have the ability to do judicial review, which is to unilaterally declare laws to be unconstitutional unless it's a clear case. And so I've also talked about in that episode judges going over what their prescribed role is according to the Federalist Society or conservative judicial values, which is calling balls and strikes, as it were. And instead we have federal judges who are activist judges. So the opinion that I went through in detail and discussed all the constitutional challenges was written by an activist judge who took the opportunity to set the record straight, quote unquote, on how the public views COVID and what the real science is. And he decried Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who was a part of the legal team for the I think the appellant, the plaintiff. And I thought that was beyond the pale. So check that episode out.
Tim Pool, Cold War Hawk, episode 201.
So for this one, I had Kyle Ancelone and Connor Freeman on. And longtime listeners of my podcast will know that I've been a harsh critic of Tim Pool throughout COVID because I watched Tim Pool for a couple years, and I all of a sudden noticed that he was really, really hawkish on China. And so I did an expose about his coverage of the Uyghur genocide, State Department campaign, PR campaign. And I had Kyle and Connor on from Conflicts of Interest to talk about that. We did a pause and play of one of Tim Pool's recent Timcast IRL shows with the CEO of Getter, and we just destroyed everything that him and Luke Rudkowski said about China, and just kind of, I don't know, revealed them for not really knowing much of anything about it.
Will Cyber 9/11 spark war in Ukraine? Episode 200.
So at the beginning of this episode, we were talking about, I just mentioned briefly the crisis between Ukraine and Russia and the West getting involved, primarily the United States being hysterical about the prospects of an imminent Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it's been talked about in discourse for years that the Russians are involved with cyber attacks. And I think we talked about, just on Friday, the U.S. State Department was putting out a huge dire all points bulletin warning, pulling all their personnel from Ukraine, telling them to leave because of an imminent Russian invasion that's supposed to happen on Tuesday before the Olympics end. And I just have my false flag. I'm just expecting it, man. And I talked about how Stavridis, he's the former NATO Supreme Commander, wrote an article saying that Russia is going to do a big cyber attack. And so I clued into that in James Corbett's work. So about it there.
And finally, before we close out, World Health Organization's Global Pandemic Treaty is global biomedical fascism. Fascism, the word that Dr. Malone used, episode 199. Give us a quick thesis for that episode.
So in that episode, I kind of realized that everyone's talking about the World Health Organization, I wanted to figure out and kind of tell the audience what that is. It's a branch of the UN, and they have these. I forgot the name for it, but I think in the early 2000s they signed this World Health Initiative, which basically is a piece of international legislation, and most of the countries of the world have signed on to it. But each country has a duty when there's an outbreak in that country to warn everyone else. And when they declare it to be an international pandemic, there's all sorts of lockstep rules and obligations that kick in, and the ability for the UN to send peacekeepers in to do quarantines and that kind of stuff if the country's not taking adequate steps. So I thought it was really important to take that apart because there have been 3 pandemics that were declared underneath it. I think MERS and the swine flu and COVID. And now the World Health Organization and the UN are talking about a pandemic treaty. So basically redoing those rules and making it more robust and providing more obligatory clauses. And I think that will include, it could be the nails in the coffin for the global tyrannical, all-encompassing surveillance state, the medical tyranny, medical martial law throughout the world. It could be, but things that would obligate like contact tracing and green passes and stuff like that. So I explained that for the audience.
Until people like Sal the agorist give us alternatives to get out of it, where we'll be able to simply surpass these tyrannical edicts. Patrick, that is all I have for you, man. Any closing arguments? I pretty much have everything that I wanted to go through.
Well, we're going to live like it really is Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, man. I don't want to spoil the ending, but what happens, there's forced drugs, that kind of stuff. Orgy porgy. Everybody is too busy doing like dopamine injections and stuff like that. And the people like us, the remnant, are reserved to reservations where we go live in nature like Native Americans on plantations or the what do they call that? Where the the reservation. Yeah. So that's what I think. I don't know. Cynical night tonight, man. Good to have you on.
Anytime, brother. Liberty Weekly. Give your plugs. Find me at odyssey.com. Keith and I don't tread on anyone, and the Libertarian Institute. Pat, close us out, brother.
So I have to mention this because I said in the last episode I was doing an episode on Project Bluebeam. I'm still going to do that, but the topic is so in depth that I couldn't get it done in 1 week. So yeah, but libertyweekly.net.